Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to our event today. My name is Yao Nyako. I'm a professor of economics at New York University. I'm really glad to have all of you here today. Uh, we're going to have a really good conversation, important conversation. We have one of the best minds on the planet to help us with that conversation. I just want to give a few remarks before we start. Um, just by way of introducing our speaker today. For those of you who are outside the field of economics, I just want you all to know that his early work has had a tremendous impact in economics. Um, it has to do with long run growth. It has to do with how to grow in the long term. Ideas are important. The knowledge that we have happens to be very, very important. Not only is it important, our speaker today also taught us how to put these in models and do good economics with it, okay? And so after his work came out, we've had a flurry of literally thousands of papers that use his model. So of course, all of us in economics, we know very, very well his work. A small joke I'll tell you guys, or a small humorous thing. I think one of the last times we met in person, this is all before COVID, the speaker and I and a few others went for a lunch in New York City. And over the lunch, of course, it was a friend of mine, Stan Bergman, a great supporter of Africa House, and his family invited us for lunch. And as I was, introducing everybody, what I just said, I said to them, I said, it's very, very important in economics. And I said, by the way, I think he's going to be winning the Nobel Prize one of these days, okay? In fact, very, very soon because of that body of work. And of course, the host and everybody said, well, very nice of you, Yao. This is Yao being, flattery and all of that. And of course, lo and behold, I think it was barely 4 or 5 months later, he did win the Nobel Prize for that work. All of you can go online and see um, the announcement, so you can read it in a bit more detail. And so the joke, of course, now is anytime I go to Stan Bergman's house and there's an intellectual there that says, hey, Yao, can you predict that I'm going to win the prize because you've got the magic touch there? So anyway, that's the small joke I wanted to pass over. Today's talk is very important for the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. As all of you know, 1960s, early 60s, late 50s, the UAE discovered oil. It was a very sparsely populated country at that time. And there was a big debate in the UAE. In other words, the UAE could have gone one of two different routes. It could have said, well, we've got this oil bonanza. Let's just enjoy it. Our population is small. Let's just live off the proceeds of the oil. Another camp, another view was that no, our ambitions should be much higher. We should try and diversify our economy. We should try and modernize. We should try and become a major power. So this was a debate that was going on in the ruling classes, the ruling families. And actually, those of you who've read the history know that there was actually a transfer of power between one person and another, one generation and another, over these debates about how to progress. Okay. The UAE took the view that migration is going to be very important and should be a part of this economic development strategy. And so thinking about development, migration, essentially important to the UAE. It was then, it is now, and we're going to be hearing about that. In my own work in Ghana, I come from a place which is fairly sparsely populated, and there too, they're thinking of the same things. It's a bit of a tribal or traditional area. Should we bring in more people in? What do we do to land that belongs to families? Should we sell them out? And so we are engaged in the similar kinds of conversations in Ghana, in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, for me personally, all of this is extremely important. So this is a wonderful piece of work that our speaker has been engaged in for many, many years now, and we're going to hear about that. So without further ado, I know you all do not want to be hearing from me. You want to hear from your speaker. So I'd like to present to you the Nobel Prize winner in economics, professor of economics, NYU, and also a great friend and a wonderful mind, Professor Paul Roma. All yours. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you for your prediction, because it helped to have a little bit of a nudge to get things to move. As Jan mentioned, the focus of my work for 2 decades at least was the economics of ideas, and the most obvious implication of the economics of ideas is that there are many things to discover, and that those discoveries can keep raising standards of living. So it's discovery which ultimately drives progress. But there's a second implication which is very important in the global context, which is that if there is one nation or one area which has discovered a very large number of ideas, it's possible for those ideas to be shared, to be reused by other nations, and this will give them the possibility of catching up very rapidly just by, without doing any new discovery during this catch-up phase, just by using what's already known. So from the perspective of the economics of ideas, the experience we've seen in China of a very rapid growth of GDP as they catch up, in some sense, that should be the norm. We should expect that. And the puzzle is why in so many other places is this not taking place? Now, the problem is that a modern economy, a modern society takes a certain amount of collective action. There are many things that people can do independently through what economists kind of broadly refer to as market-based activities. Nobody has to tell everyone what kind of shop to open, what kind of job to go take. So individual action can drive much of this, but there are critical parts of the development process that depend on collective action. There are certain things in each society which everybody have to agree on. Will we allow certain kinds of pollution? Will we allow certain kinds of abuses of human rights? How do we interact with our neighbors? So this capacity for collective action is the thing that holds back many countries. And we don't know enough. No one in the world today knows enough about how you can take a large group of people who would like the benefits of collective action. The benefits we think of as being the ones that are provided by a government, which is how collective action is expressed. In many of these societies, people would like to have a government that can make decisions, act on behalf of everyone, set up the opportunity for the market to then thrive. But it is very, very difficult to create the kind of social cohesion, consensus, legitimacy that leads to a government that can act on behalf of all citizens. So what we now face is this continuing progress in many countries, and a large number of people who are stuck in conditions where they don't know and we don't know how to give them the benefits or help them establish the benefits of effective collective action. Now, what we've seen in the past is that at small scales, one remedy for this problem is for people who live in a situation where you don't have an effective system of government, you don't have effective collective action, for them to move from the place where they currently live to a place where there is an effective system of government. And at small scales, that offers enormous opportunities to those few who get to move to the new society. But the problem is that as we try to ramp that solution up, it just collapses. It cannot be viable. And so the focus that I'll keep returning to in the talk today is the scale. We don't want to talk about measures that deal with the desire for migration, the desire for opportunity. We don't want to talk about measures that are symbolic, that work for the hundreds of thousands or millions of people. The Gallup organization right now estimates that there are about 750 million people who would leave their countries if they could, if there were some place that they could go. So the only candidate solutions are ones that could scale up to flows of hundreds of millions of people. And that presents a very daunting challenge for us. If you think about, why scale is a problem, think about the EU as a potential, recipient of new migrants. People in the EU might be willing to accept, a 0.1% of its population as new arrivals per year, maybe 450,000 people per year, but not 4.5 million, certainly not 45 million a year, but then we cannot get to 750 million people, give them the chance to move to some place where they get the benefits of an effective system of collective action, and then the benefits of the market and technology. And why would people in the EU resist this? Well, there are two pretty obvious reasons. The first is that most migrants would be relatively lower skilled workers, so that if they moved into the EU, that would be an increase in the supply of low-skilled workers. That would mean that because there's a downward sloping demand for low-skilled workers in the EU, wages would fall in the EU for low-skilled workers. So the existing low-skilled workers in the EU and the people who want to help them to keep inequality from becoming too large will not want to have a measure where tens of millions of people move in and put pressure on wages for low-skilled workers. The more subtle problem is that there's a tension between the goals that we seek for all people on Earth. We would like everyone to be, we'd like each government to be responsive in some way to accountability by its citizens. We would also like everybody who lives in a country to be eligible for equal treatment under the law. So now think about what happens if you say to a small country, we want, you'd like to help, tens of millions of people, and you want to bring them into your economy, into your society, make them full members of society, so they can vote just as you can vote if you're an existing democracy. But then the existing voters may well hesitate and say, we don't know how the new arrivals will vote if they come in and participate in our democracy. They might change the system of rules that we currently live under. And so it's very difficult to get any system where there's voice and representation for the existing citizens to accept a very large number of people who come in and who could have that same kind of voice and influence over the system of government. So this second issue is what I refer to as the constitutional trilemma. There are three things we'd like to have, but we can only get two out of the three of them. The first is that to facilitate the give opportunity to these 750 million people, we want to allow large-scale migration flows. That's the first thing. But the second thing is we want them to, on arrival or soon after arrival, have a chance at equal treatment under the law in the jurisdiction that they move to. And then three, we want that jurisdiction to be one where all of the citizens who all enjoy equal treatment can influence and hold accountable the leaders in that system of government. So kind of as a quick and broad label, I'll refer to this last kind of goal as local democracy. But of course, democracy can take many different forms. It's really essentially local accountability. But if you take those three, large-scale migration flows, equal treatment under the law, and local accountability, we cannot get all three of them at any one point in time. So many countries, think about the EU or the United States, many developed countries, we allow people to move in as refugees and have a chance at equal treatment. And then as they become full citizens, they can influence the system of government. But we simply do not allow large-scale migration flows. So we give up on the migration flows, but we have the equal treatment and the local accountability. There's another approach which has been used sometimes in some states in the Gulf. It's also been used, I think, de facto in a country like Sweden, where you let refugees come in, but you say that we can't give you the same kind of equal treatment under the law that we would like to give. So you'll be a kind of special class of citizens or residents who won't have the same kinds of privileges and rights as the existing citizens. So you can allow a little bit more migration flows, larger migration flows, and preserve local accountability, but you give up on equal treatment. And the problem with this approach is that the kind of the difference between the classes of those who are full citizens versus those who are new arrivals can over time build up problems of resentment and tension and social discord. So, and moreover, if you think about the case of Sweden, there's still a limit on the number of new arrivals that they can bring in because of this issue of potential pressure on wages for low-skilled workers. So we have the kind of the program in the United States where we simply do not allow massive migration flows. You could try the Swedish option where you let people in, but hold out for them a kind of a semi-permanent status as second-class residents. What I want to propose is a third alternative that we think about, where we give up, at least temporarily, on this notion of local accountability of government leaders. Imagine that we allow large-scale migration flows and we promise equal treatment under the law for everyone in any particular jurisdiction, but we do not offer local accountability, at least for some period of time. Now, what might that look like? I mean, a bad version of this would be to say, well, we'll just appoint a monarch or an autocrat who's in charge and who's not accountable to anyone. I don't think anyone thinks that this would be a good alternative. But think about this modified version. Imagine that there's a country that I'll call DEMCO, which is the democratic, well-developed country. Think of some country in Europe. And DEMCO wants to be helpful. Suppose it creates a new jurisdiction where it says, for now, we will appoint the governor who's in charge of getting this city up and running. That governor will be accountable to the prime minister in, let's call it, well, DEMCO, I won't put names on it, but DEMCO has a prime minister. The prime minister appoints the governor. The prime minister holds that governor accountable and makes sure he does what the people of DEMCO want to do. Remember, this is a democratic country. What they want to do is help the local residents. The prime minister makes sure that the local governor does that. But the people living in the jurisdiction that has now been set up do not actually influence the policies that that governor implements. Now that sounds very perverse, and it sounds like a bad idea at first, but think about what it facilitates. Imagine you're part of 1 million people in your new jurisdiction, and the program is, and you like the way the system is working. It's giving you opportunity, your children are thriving, and you're told that another 9 million people will come in. If the local residents can determine the policies and the actions of the local government, you might be worried about letting those 9 million in, because the people who come might not support the system of government, which is now working. Remember, they're coming from places where they can't get a system of government to work, and making sure that a system of government works is a fragile business. But if you're in one of these jurisdictions and you're told, for now at least, the local residents are not going to change the basics of the rule of law, the promise of opportunity, the guarantees about freedom, so that you, as the initial 1 million, can be not concerned that that system will change when the other 9 million come in. And those 9 million who come in, they will get exactly the same treatment under the law that you currently get. But you'll all be, protected because the system of government that you knew about when you decided to go there will be preserved for the indefinite future. Now think about how this system would evolve over time. Initially, it would be one where there's some new piece of land, a new jurisdiction, a promise of certain kinds of governance, collective action that will be carried out in this new place. And then people start to move in. But suppose this new jurisdiction is large enough to hold a city of about 10 million people. As it grows towards the 10 million people, it's no longer possible to allow large-scale migration inflows into this new jurisdiction. And then it's perfectly feasible to start to make the transition to more local accountability of government officials and less inflows. So then you kind of get back to the equilibrium, like in the United States, where you try to stick to equal treatment under the law and local accountability of government leaders to the population. But in this sequencing, when you get to the scale, the maximum scale of this new jurisdiction, it makes sense to give up on large-scale migration inflows. So if you just create one of these, well, how does that help? That helps 10 million people. That's still a drop in the bucket compared to all the people who want to go someplace. But the way we scale this is we go look for other comparable jurisdictions where other countries like DEMCO can set up a system of government, let another 10 million people move in. And then you can imagine it takes some optimism and some imagination, I agree. But you can imagine 75 new cities of about the size that could grow to the size of, say, New York City, that could be created around the world, who could accept amongst them all 750 million people who want to move to someplace new. So what this involves is a kind of a traverse through this this trilemma that I talk about, where at first we give up on local control of government officials, local accountability, and we put the accountability in the hands of some existing system of government, which already functions relatively well. And then in this new jurisdiction, over time, as you get closer to the capacity, you make the transition to some form of local accountability for government officials. So this kind of traverse is the way over time to work our way through this trilemma and ultimately achieve the goals we'd like to achieve. So that's the gist of the proposal that I'm outlining. Let me just give you a little bit of a story to give you some sense that this could be conceivable. So imagine that DEMCO wants to help another country, DEVCO. So DEVCO, developing country, is in a region which is unstable. It's still at a low level of economic development. And suppose DEVCO has 1 million refugees who have moved there from its neighbors. So DEMCO says to DEVCO, and by the way, these refugees are living in a refugee camp. And as is typically the case, the rules say if you're in a refugee camp, you can't work because the workers in DEVCO don't want to face competition in the labor market from the new refugees. So you've got 1 million people with no permanent guarantee of residency and no chance to work. And the people in DevCo can see that this is a problem. The people in DEMCO can see that this is a problem. So the kind of European DEMCO country goes to DevCo and says, look, there's an empty piece of land on your coast. And here's what we'll do to try and be helpful here. We'll create a new temporary jurisdiction on that piece of land. We'll let these 1 million residents move into that jurisdiction, but we'll create essentially border controls so that if there's goods that are produced inside this new jurisdiction, they can't be directly exported to the rest of DevCo, and people living in this new jurisdiction can't go out and get a job in DevCo. So we'll protect your local labor market from the desire to work by these refugees, and we'll instead have them be in this new jurisdiction. It's on a coastal location, so they can engage in international trade. If the people who are working there manufacture things, those manufactured things could be exported to other countries, maybe to DevCo, but maybe many others. And so they get a chance to work without posing a direct threat to the citizens of DevCo. So DevCo and DEMCO agreed to this arrangement. They enter into a lease where DEMCO leases a piece of land on the coast of DevCo. And to get things up and running, DEMCO says, we'll appoint the prime minister from DEMCO, we'll appoint a governor, and we'll get the basics going to make this new city viable. There are many things like police services, public health services, sanitation that will have to be provided locally, but those can all be provided by the people who move there. These refugees who can't work right now in the camp, they become the workers who can make everything go in this new jurisdiction. So you just need someone who sets up the systems for paying people, for employing them, for promoting the right people, for giving all these possibilities. And DEMCO, of course, also might invite in other companies who could use the skills of the citizens who will now, or the residents of this new zone that's created. So this is something which could work to the benefit of both DEMCO, which wants to be helpful but can't allow millions of people to move into its within its borders, and to the citizens of DevCo who don't like the burden of having to support the 1 million refugees, and who don't like the idea of telling people that they can't work, but yet who still want to protect their local labor markets, so they see no other alternative. So DEMCO and DevCo might both be strongly in favor of this new jurisdiction that the refugees could go to. But then think about what happens. If something beneficial happens to those refugees, these 1 million people, they get real opportunity, real safety, the benefits that they were hoping for when they left their home countries. If people can see this, then the millions of people in the surrounding countries, say another 9 million people in the surrounding countries, say, oh, we want to get access to that too, so we're going to flood into DevCo as another wave of refugees, because once we're refugees in DevCo, then we hope we'll be allowed to become residents of the new jurisdiction. So doing the right thing will, in a sense, make the problem even worse. DevCo had 1 million refugees on its hands. Now it's got potentially another 9 million who come flooding in. Now, at this point, the people in the government leaders in DEMCO and DevCo have a problem. They go to the 1 million people in the new jurisdiction and say, we'd like to let another 9 million people come in and enjoy the same benefits you have. But the people in DevCo, the people in the new jurisdiction, the 1 million in the new jurisdiction say, wait a minute, we like the way this works. We like opportunity. We like the guarantees of freedom and rights that we're getting right now. And we're worried because there are different factions amongst those 9 million people who want to come. Those factions created frictions, rivalries, sometimes even violence that kept the government from working in the countries where they now live. If you let those new factions come in, they could undermine the system of governance we like right now in this new jurisdiction and recreate the conditions that we've all been trying to escape from, of a government that just can't provide the services that we all want. So the million people say in the new jurisdiction, you can't let in another 9 million people here and then tell all of us it's up to us to figure out how to make government work. And so the residents of the current jurisdiction say, we could allow those other 9 million to come in if you in DEMCO guarantee that through your support of the governor and the system of governance, that you won't let the current system be eroded, be damaged, be undermined by the existing frictions, the fears, the rivalries of the different groups that will come under this new system. And we anticipate, but part of why the rivalry is so intense between these two groups is that each is afraid that the other will oppress the one will repress the other if they get control of something like the police services. And even if, say, ethnic group or social group A doesn't want to try and seize unilateral control of the police, if group A says, well, if group B seizes control of the police, they'll oppress us. So we in group A, we better seize control first. So the fear that one group will abuse the system of government encourages the other group to try and abuse the system of government. But if both of these groups know that neither can get control of the system, that there's an existing system of governance which does not allow capture of something like the police services, which is ultimately accountable to the prime minister and the voters in DEMCO. If you don't have that fear, then the two groups, Group A and Group B, might be able to live in harmony around each other, because they both know that neither A nor B is going to be able to take control of the police. And then A and B can get the benefits of stability, peace, opportunity, education. And over time, this history of animosity will go away, and everyone will have a stake in the preservation of the basic rule of law and a system which guarantees equal treatment for all. That there'll never be a chance that somehow A will force B into the status of being second-class citizens, or B will force A into that same kind of status. So the idea of an external system of accountability for local government, which guarantees this principle of equal treatment, this can remove the fear that animates so much of the friction and violence that undermines governance in so many countries. And if people can live together without fear, then they can establish the kind of social ties and social connections, the broad basis for taking over the local system of government at some point in the future. The point of this narrative is to make it clear that it's the existing 1 million residents of the new jurisdiction who say, we do not want you, DEMCO, to turn over to us local responsibility for the governance, local responsibility for setting up and maintaining our system of governance. And we especially don't want you to turn it over to us if you're going to allow in another 9 million people who currently have a history of fear and antagonism. So the problem with this kind of proposal is that people link it to historical activities where, say, a European power set up a colonial regime, which it imposed on people who did not want it. This is a very different system where there are people who say, we want to live under the systems of governance that rich and well-developed countries have established. We want the rule of law. We want equal treatment under the law. We want security. And so we're asking for a government which has experience with this to set it up locally, and then to allow people like us to come into this new place and for us all to live together and get the benefits that technology and the market can offer. So the bottom line is that, and by the way, there is a historical precedent for a system like this. Hong Kong, under the British, was governed by a governor who was appointed by the prime minister in Britain. That governor maintained certain commitments about how the system in Hong Kong would work. And large numbers of people moved into Hong Kong when it was under British rule. The existing residents in Hong Kong were not perturbed by this. Of course, people living in the United Kingdom were not perturbed either. So the governor who was in charge of the system of government in Hong Kong, that structure could allow both local residents and people in the country which is holding the governor accountable. This can let all of them be comfortable with large-scale inflows into this new kind of jurisdiction. Now there are many details that one would have to work through in a proposal like this, and maybe some of those will come up in the Q&A. One obvious question is that if this is a lease on land originally provided by DevCo, does that lease expire? Or is there some process whereby the new jurisdiction could become a part of DevCo at some point in the future? So, this was kind of one of the issues which has been contentious and difficult in Hong Kong. So we can think about that possibility and think about how to structure things so that looking forward far into the future, we can have some confidence that these arrangements will work relatively well. But let me just close with a vision of what global competition could look like under this arrangement. Think about DevCo, in setting up this new city, can actually finance it without charity, because the land that DevCo has a lease for becomes far more valuable once a new city gets established there. So that this can be a self-financing kind of venture. And so DevCo might be interested in doing more of this. If you want to think about it in an analogy, this is very large-scale real estate development. You could pick a piece of land big enough for 10 million people. It's worth almost nothing right now. And then you turn it into a modern city. It could go from something like thousands or millions of dollars into having a value that could be worth something like $1 trillion. So this is something that DevCo may actually want to encourage. And then let me link this back to another point about infrastructure. China is trying to develop a system of infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative that would link many countries. The unfortunate reality about infrastructure is you can never pay for it from the fare box or the shipping fees or the passenger fees. Infrastructure never pays for itself. But the way you can finance it is that infrastructure, like links to the rest of the world, can take a piece of land and make it much more valuable. So it's the gains in the value of the land that gets connected through the infrastructure to the rest of the world that can actually be used to finance the infrastructure that connects this new place to other places around the world. So you could imagine a kind of competition where the United States is creating new jurisdictions by signing leases with various countries around the world. And China is doing the same thing, perhaps along the Belt and Road Initiative, because it sees that ultimately local government will not be able to pay back the loans and pay for the infrastructure that China is building unless new cities develop, which makes the land that's connected by the infrastructure so much more valuable. So you can imagine kind of a rivalry that breaks out between the United States and China that are creating these new jurisdictions and that are competing for new residents by soliciting migration from people all over the world. To succeed, this kind of large-scale real estate development has to attract people. And then there's a kind of a force that holds a little bit of a check on both the Chinese government and the US government. How do we make sure that they do this in a way which is beneficial to the residents? Well, if the residents have a choice between different systems, if it's not sufficiently beneficial, they'll go to the other one instead of the first one. So, and then you could imagine the EU as well, or individual nations in the EU setting up comparable new jurisdictions like this. So this could change, especially the rivalry between the United States and China, can take that away from the traditional military rivalry where they compete by building more aircraft carriers, and into a really productive competition between systems. You know, the kind of the critics from the left in the world would say, well, the US system, if they set this up, it'll be controlled by corporate entities. The workers will not get high wages. It'll be miserable. And then the answer to them is, well, you know, if that's the way the US sets it up, people are going to rather go to the Chinese place. And in Chinese cities, people will say, well, the kinds of local rights and guarantees, civic participation that the Chinese will offer, the system of tracking, monitoring of individuals, people won't like that. And then the answer is, well, you know, if that's unattractive about the Chinese cities, people won't go there. They'll go instead to the cities that the US offers. And maybe there'll be some European new jurisdictions that can offer a kind of a middle ground, which is even more desirable than either what the US or China offers. So we could have a real competition and rivalry between systems, but one which is actually beneficial to the whole world. And as I emphasized before, does not require charity. It just requires the harnessing of the gains that can come in the value of the land when you let people have opportunities to work, acquire skills, and to thrive. So that would be my vision for the competition that would be great for the entire world to see in the coming century. Let me close with that and turn it over to any questions that y'all wants to ask me, or reactions, and or questions he might collect from the audience that you may have about this kind of proposal.
Okay, so thank you so much, Paul. We've been discussing this for a number of years now, on and off, and anytime I hear you talking about this again, ideas flow through my mind. I see it in a different way. So this was great. I really enjoyed the everything. So what I'll do is I've written down most of the comments on my iPad here. I'll read them out. For the audience, this is being recorded. And so it will be made available. I think there'll be an email link on the Institute page. So those who wrote in and asked if this is going to be recorded, yes, it is recorded. Yes, you will see it. Yes, please share it, okay? I think it was a wonderful conversation. The very first question was, how would your model work in non-Western liberal democracies? So I think, you know, you've answered a bit of that. But again, you know, I just want to tease out a few things for you. So I'm just imagining Africa, and you want to, create one of these DEMCOs in Africa. How would it work? And I know you've spoken about democracy and versus colonialism, but I can tell you when I speak to my colleagues in Africa, it's always like, gee, here come the Europeans again. Weren't we colonized once anyway? Why should it be the Europeans again? So do you want to talk to that?
Yeah. Well, I think there are many things to be to be established, many choices that would have to be made. in creating one of these new jurisdictions. And this is part of why I think it would be very good for the world if there were different governments that were engaged in this activity. So China doing it alongside of the United States and Europeans doing it, perhaps other countries. You could imagine India doing this, Japan doing this. Any country that has a system of government with a prime minister or president that can appoint and hold accountable the local leader, many different countries could engage in this activity. And what you'd see is different choices those governments would make in how they set this up. China has more experience with, say, a different level of monitoring of social media, of individual discourse. So you could characterize the United States as the Wild West, where we let these tech firms just take advantage of everybody. China as a more government-controlled system, which puts some limits on what can happen online. Let China and the United States set these up, and then let people choose where to go, and try to make sure, as part of like the baseline international commitment, is that any jurisdictions like this have to allow exit. That if people get there and they don't like what they're experiencing, they can go someplace else. And as long as there are other places that are in this same business of competing for residents, that will be a real competitive threat. So on many dimensions where there could be different choices, these different jurisdictions could offer choices, and ultimately the ones that best serve the interests of the potential migrants will be the ones that succeed. Now, in addition to just something simple like how do you regulate social media, digital media, there are very important discussions and decisions to make about if we're going to make an ultimate transition to something like local accountability for government officials, what will that look like? Will it be a representative democracy? Will it be direct democracy? People just vote on every decision? Will it be some hybrid form? Different countries establishing these regimes could outline different types of local governance and local control of government officials. And here too, I think, potential residents will choose between alternatives that they find more or less attractive. There will still, of course, be some concerns about something like national pride. The citizens of what I was calling DevCo, they might say, why do we need to let this foreign country come in and set up the new jurisdiction? Why don't we just set it up ourselves? If a country like DevCo is willing to try and set up a new jurisdiction, and if it can set it up in a way which actually makes it credible and attractive for people to move there, the citizens of DevCo could get into this game as well. But the thing we have to be realistic about is that many countries like DevCo are at level of development system. And if DevCo is having trouble doing that internally, it's a little bit implausible that they could do it well in this new jurisdiction when they're having trouble doing it into the country. So I think you could have a system where even the developing countries could compete in this business of setting up new jurisdictions, but it might be that the ones set up by the more established developers turn out to be more competitive. And I think we should all accept that as being an okay outcome. Maybe DevCo actually learns about make sure that the security services can't be taken over by one, say, ethnic group or religious group and be used to oppress another. The citizens of DevCo might actually learn about how to do that if there's a local jurisdiction nearby which is doing it well. So if we just set aside the concerns about national pride, I think this is a constructive way.
Okay, Paul, so we cannot hear you now. Hopefully you'll come back.
Sorry, I lost you for a second.
No worries.
Dr. Zoom was saying, Paul, you've talked long enough, so be quiet.
All right. Okay, so can you hear me, Paul?
Yes, I can.
All right. Okay. So great. We lost the very last part of what you said, but I think we got the gist of it. So I'm just going to continue reading some of these comments. I think you're answering many of them. You mentioned Hong Kong. Somebody asked these leases, how long will they last? I can't remember what Hong Kong was. Was it 99 years, if I'm not wrong? And so what is
there was a part, yeah. There was a part of it which had a 99-year lease, and that turned out to be a problem because I think the kind of structure you'd like it to put in place is one where there's a lease that can be maintained indefinitely unless all parties agree to revoke it and merge the two jurisdictions together. So you could imagine a process whereby at some point in the future, the residents of the new jurisdiction and the residents of DevCo vote on a proposal that would integrate the new jurisdiction back into the system of governance in DevCo. And if you don't put an artificial time limit on this, there will very likely come a time where everybody can see the benefits of unification. But I think we shouldn't put an artificial limit on this because it could force a transition at a time when people aren't ready, and that could be costly.
So, but let me push you a little bit on that, Paul. So taking the Hong Kong example, my guess would be that if the residents of Hong Kong had to vote, they would say, I do not want to merge with China.
Yeah.
If China, knowing that the residents will say that in 99 years hence,
yeah,
would at the time of signing decide, well, I'm not going to sign because the rules would tell me when it's time to hand over, you have to vote, and they're not going to vote for it. So how do you, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think, go back to like the current situation in DevCo. They've got 1 million refugees. They got 9 million people who could come flooding in at any moment. And they're struggling to create the conditions of effective government to sustain development. So this prospect of creating a new jurisdiction on land, suppose it's land, that they don't even control right now. They're, kind of terrorist groups or militias that control the land. They're saying, we're going to give up control over some land we can't control now anyway. We don't know if when it might return back to being part of the nation. We don't know if it will ever return back. But given the options that we face right now, ceding control for at least some period of time over that small area may be beneficial to us and beneficial to the whole region because these people in the refugee camp can work. The people who might come flooding into our country can just go to this new place, and everybody might benefit from the reduction in the tensions between these different competing factions, which are making the whole region unstable. So a current governor of DevCo may well say, well, it's a bit of a concession to kind of give away control of some land and not know when or if we'll ever get it back. But given the limited alternatives we face, it seems like it's worth trying.
Okay. Great. Another question had to do with the benefits to the locals in the country versus those who are in this new city, new area, etc. Yeah. And what happens when? So I'm gonna make this a two-part question. A, what happens when those who are in the country itself, they look at this new city and they're saying the folks there are better than us in the rest of the country.
Right. Yep.
And we're importing people there. How about us? Okay. And so that's the question. And related to that, I think Brasilia, if I'm not mistaken, was created, from the ground up. It was a wasteland, and they created it for exactly that reason, for that purpose. It was a big development scheme. The then president of Brazil hurried up and tried to create Brasilia. And so the question to you is, should national governments be doing that by themselves? What's so unique about your idea?
Yep. Well, on the first question, I think there's some interesting options here. The government of DevCo might say to DEMCO, which is going to be, administering this new jurisdiction, the refugees from other countries that move into there, they have to stay there. They don't have the right to cross the border and come into DevCo. But we might want to let the current residents of DevCo go into that jurisdiction and move back. So some of our current citizens could move into this new jurisdiction, work there for some period of time, still remain citizens of the DevCo. So you could offer a kind of a special privilege for the current residents of DevCo. They get to come in and out, whereas the people who move in from other countries have to stay in the jurisdiction. They can't move into DevCo. This would open up some opportunities for DevCo. It might also be a little bit threatening for DevCo if it has a local business center, some local urban centers, and too much of the activity were to leave the existing places and go to this new jurisdiction. That could be harmful. DevCo could conceivably set up its own jurisdiction right next door to the new one. So it's kind of like Shenzhen near Hong Kong, and that might be one of the ways to balance these interests. But I think there's a way to offer the options that will make this even more attractive to a typical person, a typical citizen of DevCo. Now, I've forgotten what your second part of that question was.
No, so I think you've answered it. The second part was, why doesn't the nation itself, DevCo, create its own jurisdiction?
That's right.
So this was the Brasilia example.
Well, yeah. Well, there is a little bit of evidence about if you're going to create a new city, don't try and make it a city which caters to rich people. Brasilia was a place where government officials, rich Brazilians, wanted to be able to go and get away from the poor. And, that's just, I think, morally suspect. But from a perspective of kind of, economic development and real estate development, it's just a bad strategy. There aren't that many rich people. So these new jurisdictions have to be places where the living accommodations are very inexpensive. People build them themselves. A lot of the work is initially things like garment assembly, which pay relatively low wages. But you can create a new city which caters to people who have low levels of education, low levels of skills, firms that want to employ those kind of workers, and then move over time towards a system with many more high-income, high-skilled individuals. So the mistake with Brasilia was that it was marketed for people who wanted to get away from the people we really should be trying to help with these new cities.
Another question, and I think you answered it partially, but I'll ask it again. The fear about religion. And so, a lot of conflict throughout, the time, human history. We all know of the religious wars in Europe, countries that were essentially brothers and sisters fighting the 30-year war, the 100-year war, etc. And so I think the question is asking, what do you do about religion? And what if you have a preponderance of one religion as opposed to another? I think this is part of your conflict question. But anyway, it was asked, and so maybe you can talk directly to that.
Well, let me just point to a kind of a fact, which is that In Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, Shiites and Sunnis lived in mixed neighborhoods in relative peace with each other. Now, there were many terrible things about Iraq under Saddam Hussein, but one of the things that it did offer was a system of security forces that both the Shiites and the Sunnis knew were not going to be captured by the other group. So this process of like ethnic cleansing and pushing everybody out from your neighborhood and then establishing a local militia, this was all created by the destruction of the overarching system, which protected everybody. So I think of this as evidence that if you can create conditions where everybody feels safe, they can tolerate. I can live near people who have a different religious faith, and we can tolerate each other because they know that our group is not going to try and take over the police and oppress them, and we knew that their group is not going to take over the police and oppress us. You know, take over like by creating their own local militia, because there's a system of government which simply will not let that happen, that will keep us all safe. And I think the reduction in fear that comes from safety is the best way to establish the conditions of tolerance that we'd like to see in a society which allows different people to pursue many different activities and to hold different religious beliefs.
Okay. One question for you. Are you thinking of DevCos as only being poor countries? Could America be a DevCo and take part of the desert in, you name it, and bring in 10 million people?
This is a great question. I could imagine the United States doing this at some point in the future. I can imagine Australia doing this. I mean, Australia's got these immense sort of swaths of coastal area where people could come. I even, just to kind of be provocative, I wrote an op-ed or gave an interview in Sweden where I said, Sweden can do this. Just go someplace on the Baltic coast where there's very few people settled. Just create a new place where these refugees who feel like they're not part of your society, create a new place where they could go in and live, create your own Hong Kong. This, of course, got me some email death threats from Sweden, but it also prompted, I think, a very revealing conversation I had with some officials, which went as follows. They said, look, for this to work, the new jurisdiction has to have different levels of social services, different average levels of income than we provide to all of our citizens in Sweden. It's just the reality of just the budget, constraints. You can't provide the same level of income and social services in this new place as we provide in Sweden. Now, but many migrants would be happy to move to a place that doesn't provide those very high levels of services. But this person said, if the Swedes just look over the fence right next door, and they say children who aren't getting access to schools that are as good as Swedish schools, and people who don't have the same, material resources, smaller apartments than say we have in Sweden, Swedes are going to feel very uncomfortable about the inequality that they see nearby. So we understand it would be good to create this kind of new place, because it wouldn't be as good as Sweden, but it would be much better than where people are coming from. But here we Swedes, we just couldn't be comfortable with it when we have to look at it right next door. So let's go set it up someplace else. And so, in effect, the Swedes were kind of saying, well, let's go do a deal with Australia. There's a piece of their coastline that's going to be so far away from everybody else in Australia. Let's go do it there. And you can play through this same kind of logic in the United States, or even a new zone you could create on the border between the United States and Canada. To be clear, what's part of the problem about allowing more migration in the United States? Right now, the Republican Party is worried that if new migrants come in and then ultimately get the chance to vote, they will tend to vote for Democrats, and that will put the Republicans at a long-run disadvantage. Now, kind of one reaction is to say, well, then Republicans, why don't you stop being so hostile to migrants and make a viable kind of claim at getting some of them to support your policies? But, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But the Republicans might be willing to say, okay, we could create this Hong Kong-like zone, say on the border of the United States and Canada, and have the United States and Canada jointly appoint the governor or something. As long as those people aren't in any time in the near future going to vote in US elections, we're not going to be threatened by it politically. And then the Republicans, if they're smart, might even say, at some point when this place becomes rich and viable, there are a lot of people who might want to move from that, jurisdiction into the United States. They might be well educated, they might be affluent, they might be Republican voters. So later we might set up a system where you could kind of move from the new jurisdiction into the United States with a green card, maybe even have a chance at citizenship in a way that doesn't threaten the current Republican Party. So I think it's a long shot, but it's worth imagining all the different places around the world where we could do this.
Right. So just to pick up on that, there was another question about high-skilled migrants. And so a lot of implicitly what I heard from you a lot of the time seemed to me, probably incorrectly, had to do with low-skilled migrants leaving countries which are not doing that well and coming to DevCo. So the question was about high-skilled migrants, because you'll need the high skills to grow that DevCo. And the high-skilled they can go to DEMCOs or DevCos, right? Right. And so you're going to have to get the incentives right. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, as I was saying before, it seems crass, but think about this as a real estate venture. Some rich country like Sweden's going to create a brand new city that's ultimately going to attract 10 million people. I mean, the reality is that the bulk of the people you can attract are going to be low skilled. So then you have to ask, okay, well, where are we going to get the nurses and the doctors and the police officers to do all of the functions in this new jurisdiction? Well, you get them the same way that other countries got them during the development process. You educate them locally and you raise the skill levels. So the most ambitious, the hardest working, the most talented will acquire these skills and become the local high skilled workers. But I think just the viability of this kind of project, if Sweden were to say, well, we got a piece of land we negotiated someplace else, let's try and make this work, but let's make it a place that just tries to attract rich people. We'll have condos there, we'll have entertainment, we'll make it, kind of a special zone at trying to attract rich people. There's just no market right now. Rich people can move anywhere in the world. There's no captive market you can capture by saying we're going to create a new kind of Brasilia special city that attracts the rich and the talented. The opportunity here is to create the kind of city that, say, New York City was in 1900, a city that was accepting millions of people who got their first jobs doing things like garment assembly. That's the way to develop a successful city. In 1900, New York City didn't say, well, let's invite in all of the royalty and all of the wealthiest people, and that's somehow how we're going to grow the city. It just wouldn't have worked.
That's right. I love your idea on your comment on New York City, because I think it was you who told me where NYU is in New York. Washington Square Park used to be the northern boundary of New York. It was farmland. All of the Upper East Side, Midtown was all farmland, and so I think New York is actually a very good idea. And I think.
And people forget that it was only 100 years ago that New York City had the kind of sweatshops that we now think about in, kind of in Bangladesh. And, we had things like fires, a famous fire in this building that, you and I walked past, where people died in this sweatshop because the conditions were so terrible. So even if you start as a city recruiting people who have very low levels of skill, who are going to work in something like garment assembly kind of manufacturing sites, there's a pretty quick path where you get from like New York City of this famous fire in the sweatshop was 1915. There's a pretty quick path where you get from New York City of 1915 to New York City of 2015, and it's a very viable process. You're not going to get there if you try and start right away by building New York City of 2015. It just won't work.
Right. Very good point. And, you know, anytime I'm talking about the UAE, and especially to people who are a little bit critical of the migrants who are currently there, it's a failure to understand the United States has been there. And so there's a question I want to ask you. How do you deal with the following, which I think is faulty logic, right? And so you take a place in DevCo, you take maybe the low-skilled workers in the UAE or in any country, and you get people, particularly on the left, okay, and I consider myself on the left. However, in this particular argument, I disagree with them. They would say, look at all these people. Their living standards are low. It could have been much higher. Therefore, the country that hired them are bad people, exploiting, and they fail to realize that where they're coming from was much, much worse. So in other words, there are people who have the mindset, don't help anybody unless you can help them to the max. Half helping is worse than no helping. And that's a logic I never understand, but how do you?
But I think, you know, this conversation I had with the person in Sweden kind of reflected an awareness that it was illogical, but it was a very, you know, it was almost an inevitable emotional reaction that when we see stark differences, stark inequality very close up, when we see it in our daily lives, it just produces a moral reaction that this is wrong. So I think my advice would be to myself and to you is that in these conversations with people, we don't try and tell them you're wrong to have a moral reaction against inequality. You know, it's just like, it's natural to have that to have that reaction, but still, let's look at what are the practical alternatives. If we do nothing, that's maybe not as good as some other things we could try to do. So I try very hard not to tell people they're wrong to have certain kind of moralistic reactions, but to say, well, let's take those as given, but then let's see if we can work around it in a way that will actually help all of these people who are not being helped under our current system.
You said that so well. Looks like you're going into politics or something, right? That was said so well. Don't tell them they're wrong, but ease them into the argument.
Well, you know, but there's actually an important point. I have a mantra that I now use with people, which I say, feelings are facts, okay? If someone feels like it's wrong to do this, that's a fact. And you can't go to that person and say, you know, you're wrong to feel that. And you feel what you feel. And there's a reality to that. But let's accept that. And let's still see, is there some room for compromise? And, you know, is there some room to do something that you feel is less than ideal, but might be better than just continuing with what we have? And I think if we look for that kind of middle ground, we might actually be able to make real progress.
Excellent, excellent, well said. There's just one question here. I think you've answered it, but it was a question from the audience. And it was posed as, what if DevCo gives its worst land, hot, humid, mosquito-ridden, etc.? Won't that be a bad thing? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it might mean that if you have enough of these cities that are being, or these new jurisdictions being created, excuse me, I have a bit of an asthma cough. If you have enough of these cities being created, some might be in locations that are so, unattractive that they don't succeed. But that's okay. I mean, they don't have to all succeed. We just need places where people can go. And let me just say as well that if you think about Singapore was not a location that in terms of climate was particularly attractive, but yet a system of government which gave people a chance to work, to have opportunity to acquire skills, to be safe, to live as Muslims and ethnic Chinese together without any fear of riots. If you can create that, you can overcome a lot of other disadvantages about a location. And by the way, you know, the value of the land in Singapore, when Malaysia basically gave it away, they thought this land in Singapore was worth about nothing, you know. Now, right, the people in Singapore who look at this tell me that the land in Singapore is worth about $1 trillion US. that's before you account for the value of the buildings that sit on top of it. And so part of why Singapore financed itself and succeeded was it captured a lot of that gain in the value of the land and used it to finance the system of government that actually made the place viable. So Singapore succeeded without any charity from the rest of the world, and there's no reason why we can't do the same thing in other places.
Excellent. So this is, as you keep saying, it's all about real estate. So I'll not call you Paul Romer, the real estate dealer, right?
Yeah, right.
I have one other question here, which I don't think you mentioned much, but let's hear your thoughts on it. So the question is, talking now about the source countries, okay? So those countries that are losing people, is it going to be the case, somebody asked here, are we going to have an empty Syria, an empty Venezuela? It's going to be, I think it's called the Great Sucking Sound. And so we slowly depopulate certain nations.
Yep. Well, I think there's a little bit of a risk of that, but I think that wouldn't be a bad thing. It would say to a country, if you, the people who are still here, cannot find a way to establish a government which makes it safe to live here, which makes it attractive for people to live here, then you should lose all of your citizens. There's no reason we should doom people indefinitely to these, really intolerable conditions. But if you can get those basics right, use the threat of migration as part of the impetus to reach some compromises, do some deals, get things working locally, then you can benefit a lot. Because, you think about countries like China, which had many people go out to other places to live, to get educated, to work. Those people, many of them came back, or they were kind of part of trading networks that the local citizens could still interact with. So having some of your citizens go get established in other places is not a bad thing, as long as you can get your act together locally and meet at least the minimum viable conditions for creating a place where people want to live.
Okay, excellent. It reminds me of some of my own work on the brain drain. Anytime somebody accuses me of having left Ghana and not, contributing back, I just tell them that, Ghana can also benefit from from my going back, and I'm doing research there as well. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So we're almost slowly getting to the end now. Let me just look through this, see if I missed any. Let's see. Is this so Venezuela? We have, who is going to take care of diplomacy and defense against external actors? Yeah.
Well, I think, remember, DEMCO is the one that's appointing the governor. DEMCO, if the conditions in the surrounding countries are sufficiently, unsettled and there's a real risk of violence, DEMCO may want to establish a security force that protects this new jurisdiction, or at least protects the border from invasion. But again, this doesn't have to be, officers of the military of DEMCO who then come down and become this force. The people who are living there in this new jurisdiction become the members of the security force that's organized by DEMCO. And remember, part of what DEMCO is doing is telling everybody, we're going to use this force to protect ourselves from invasion. We're not going to use it to try and suppress some internal group or to help one group versus another. This is only here to protect us from invasion. And border protection, I think, will be a real threat, probably not so much a real issue, not so much from organized invasion by one national army against another, but we are seeing many of these kind of militias and, kind of informal groups that engage in violence. And any nation is going to have to be able to protect its borders from incursion by those kinds of groups. Or not just nation, any jurisdiction. And also, somebody's going to have to make sure that some members of these terrorist groups don't move in and start to operate within the new jurisdiction. Security is a very important issue. And one of the most important things a government has to do is establish the conditions that make sure that people in this new jurisdiction aren't afraid of getting, blown up in a terrorist attack when they go to work and go to school each day.
In our last 5 minutes, I want to do two things, okay? So the first is I'm going to read to you a comment, all right? And I think this gets to the heart of many people who do not like the idea, okay?
Yeah.
I'm going to read to you. You sort of answered it, but it's as we're closing. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. So you can, it's a way in which you can summarize everything.
Okay.
And then the second thing is I'm going to ask you a question, which is essentially, what should we do next? Because I'm sold on this idea. And so It's going to be two parts, but let me ask you the first one. I'll let it stop. I'll repeat the second one, and then we'll close. Okay? And so,
Sure.
So I'm going to read it. An anonymous attendee, your idea seems to be based on the assumption that developing countries without functioning governments have problems because citizens of the country are incompetent. This is incredibly patronizing. Many of these countries are still suffering from the trauma of colonialism and economic exploitation by US, Europe, China. Why should developed countries expect a return on their investment when helping their former colonies? Trillions of dollars worth of wealth they effectively stole could and should be returned by forgiving loans and building infrastructure in existing cities. I mention this because, as you can imagine, and I'm sure I think you mentioned this throughout your talk, but it's a good way to sort of wrap up before I ask you my final question. So any response?
Sure. Well, so on this, I mean, the first thing is I want to do what I said I'd do before, is just acknowledge that feelings are facts. And many people have this feeling about this proposal, and I understand that. All I would ask of them is engage in this discussion, and let's see if we can come up with something else that maybe seems better. Let's look for something which is better than the status quo where so many people feel trapped. And then the second thing I would do is just say to them, I personally do those people move to a system where the government is functioning, very quickly become productive citizens, hardworking, ambitious, model participants in society. So all of the people who are trapped in these bad equilibria have the potential good neighbor like to, but they can't realize that potential when they're stuck in a system that's broken. It's like a system that's broken tends to perpetuate itself, and things like and bad existing system, but government that brings out their better side, they will all, they will all do so, and will all thrive. So there's nothing wrong with the people. There is something wrong with multiple equilibria. You can get a bunch of people stuck in an equilibrium which is bad for everybody and brings out the bad side in everybody. They could all see there'd be another equilibrium in which they'd all be better, but they just don't know how to get from the bad one to the good one. And what I'm really trying to hold out is that this is a feasible process where these same people get from the bad equilibrium to living together with each other in the good equilibrium. And there's got to be a way for us to
All right. So we can't hear you, Paul. Let's see if Paul comes back. All right, it looks like we lost Paul, so we just wait a quick second. If anybody else has some questions, please put them in the question and answer. I will make sure I communicate all of the questions to Paul. And let's see if Paul will pick up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My my technology is not cooperating with me today. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well. Thank you, thank you. So,
okay, so even if I got cut off, you should go on to like our closing comment.
So I think we're left with the last minute or so. And so, you know, I'm fascinated by these ideas. As I look through the chat, many people are really fascinated. And by the way, I really enjoyed this presentation. I've heard it before, I've spoken to you, but this has been a much clearer. So what should we be doing? So if we buy into this idea, should I call the president of Ghana and say, hey, let's set a DevCo here? Or yeah. Is it the president of the, what should we do? All of us in the audience, what are our marching orders?
Well, so, you know, I've struggled with this. As you know, I tried to go talk to some governments about, let's just try and get this up and running. My sense right now is that this is an idea which needs more development amongst scholars and the kind of intellectual elites around the world. You know, I think what we should do is that person who wrote the critique, who said, you know, this is patronizing, this is a bad idea. That person and you and I and many others should start the broad discussion to say, let's find something that could work better. Let's use this kind of proposal I'm making as a way to kind of broaden the discussion, and let's look together at the pluses and minuses of various specific alternatives and see if we can come up with a version that we can support. And I think if we can build this kind of intellectual climate of, you know, criticism and analysis and potentially support, that might give elected officials enough confidence to try something like this in you know, in some particular case. So I think what we can do is what we do as scholars, what we do as students, is discuss, learn, disagree, argue. But out of that process, I hope what will emerge is something that gives us a better path forward for those 750 million people who are so distressed right now.
Okay, so on that note, and with our marching orders, we'll do as you say. We will continue the conversation and see where that heads. So again, Paul, I really enjoyed this. It's given me food for thought. I know it's going to influence what I'm doing in Ghana, my own research in Africa. So, no, real thank you for being with us on behalf of NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. Thank you. I thank the Institute folks. All of you have worked very hard to put all of this together, and it's really great having the Institute. There are a number of events that they all have, and I know that this conversation will continue. So thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks a lot, all of you in the audience. And thank you, NYU Abu Dhabi Institute.
It was my pleasure, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in Abu Dhabi with you, but someday soon we'll get back to normal.
That's right. That's a promise there, Paul. Okay, so we look forward to seeing you in Abu Dhabi. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.